Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning. My name is Donald Mackay. I'm the CEO of XA Global Trade Advisors. And joining me today is Arista Nell, who's one of our analysts and somebody who focuses particularly on the scrap metal industry. This is the second scrap metal report that we've launched, the first one having come out at about the same time last year. And as we were busy drafting this report in the last few days and wrapping up, what struck me is this is almost a perfect microcosm of what is wrong with the way we think about industrial policy in South Africa. And so even though the report is replete with lots of data and examples around the scrap metal sector, it's useful to think of this in a slightly more abstract way as well, as the way we do industrial policy and why, in so many cases, our industrial policy is delivering suboptimal outcomes. So just a bit of a background for those of you who are not in the scrap metal sector. There are basically five big sources of scrap metal, and those are the ones that you see on the screen. Now, a very small portion.
Donald, apologies. Can you please just share your presentation?
Oh my goodness, has it stopped sharing?
Yeah.
Sorry about that. Right. Presentation being shared again. Sorry, folks. Hold on one moment. It doesn't want to share. Give me 1 second. I apologize. I don't know what is happening here. Try again. That working?
Just flip it other side around, please.
All right. Is that better?
Perfect.
My apologies. So thank you, Arista. So those five that you see on the screen in front of you, those are the big sources of scrap metal. Now, a fairly modest portion of that is virgin scrap, which is coming typically as a byproduct of a manufacturing process, but most of it is obsolete scrap. Now, just a little bit of some very elementary economics here for a moment. The volume of available scrap metal has nothing to do with how much demand there is for scrap metal. So scrap metal is generated, and its generation has nothing at all to do with how much people want to buy. And so that creates a very unusual situation. So if you think about it for a minute, we're in a situation where our economy is quite distressed. State-owned enterprises are not doing terribly well. All of these sectors that you see on the screen are under some kind of pressure. And as that pressure increases, so the amount of scrap metal available into the market drops, or at absolute best kind of remain stable. Now, you could increase that supply of scrap by either importing from other countries, but were you to import the scrap metal from other countries, you would be competing with everyone else in the world that buys scrap metal. And if you didn't want to buy them from other countries, you can't really go to someone and say, what we really need you to do is set up a scrap metal factory. And so you could pay more for the product. And if you paid more, somebody in the Northern Cape with an old tractor on their farm might find it worth their while to get that tractor into the scrap metal stream. So you could pay more, but that is problematic because the scrap consuming sector is not naturally competitive. And so you're left with really only one option, which is you go to government and you lobby government to apply controls to reduce the flow of scrap into the international market. Now, importantly, scrap is becoming increasingly valuable around the world. And so you're competing with countries that are prepared to pay a premium on scrap. You should ask yourself a question: why is it that we can send our scrap halfway around the world to a country like India, who can then purchase our scrap at the global price, do stuff with it, produce whatever they produce, and still sell it profitably. So that is in fact what is occurring. Why does that not happen here? And so there are two big cost drivers for a mini mill. So a mini mill is the company that buys up the scrap steel, for example, melts it down, converts it into rebar or some other form of steel, and they would then sell that product. And there are two big cost drivers for a mini mill: the price of the scrap metal and the price of electricity. So unlike a primary producer of steel like ArcelorMittal, who tends to use mainly gas to power their furnaces, the mini mills all use something called an electric arc furnace, which is quite an energy intensive beast, as you can well imagine. And so as the price of electricity goes up, something they have no control over, so the need to keep that price of the scrap metal manageable becomes increasingly important. And so there are three big ways that the scrap consuming sector is supported in South Africa. In fact, sometimes there's a fourth way, but let's get to the three main ones. So the first one, the big one, is called the price preference system. So what this does is it says, I have some scrap metal, I want to export it because I can get a good price for it abroad, but I can't export it. So I have to go to ITAC, the International Trade Administration Commission, and I say to them, here's the grade of scrap I have. I would like to get an export permit. They then circulate from all of those scrap recyclers. They circulate to the consumers of scrap what the different grades of scrap that are available. And those companies need to be provided with that scrap metal at a discount to the global price. And that is on steel, which is the thrust of this particular report, but it's at a 30% discount, and it varies by the metal. Now, if we just take that for a moment, we transfer approximately 8.5 billion Rand a year in value from the scrap generators, mostly going through recyclers and ending up with the mini mill. So that's a fairly meaty transfer of value by way of the price preference system. However, not satisfied with that, they've also added an export duty. Now, the export duty was in fact meant to replace the price preference system, which is beset with all kinds of problems. It's administratively very intense. It's a complicated process of sending information to ITAC. They've got to circulate it. People make offers. Sometimes people make offers in bad faith. They don't see through the offer right in injury time. You're sort of stuck with this material. So there are problems. And the intention was to get rid of the PPS, put in some kind of export duty. And then in injury time, there was a lobby, and the lobby group that made the approach to the DTIC and ITAC were made up, and in fact, they had a cool name. They were called the Working Group, and their identities were all secret. And in fact, their identities only came into the open after a court case was launched, and then we got to see who had done the lobbying. The names that pop out of it are quite astonishing. So they are companies like Score Metals, the biggest consumer of scrap in the country, Capegate, but also very strangely officials from both ITAC and the DTIC. And so they do this lobby. The companies that are represented all come out of the Steel Master Plan Oversight Committee. It's a very convoluted name, but this is the group that are responsible for implementing the Steel Master Plan. Now, they are not the Steel Master Plan Committee. They come out of there. That committee had in fact refused access to the scrap metal recyclers. So despite the fact that that Steel Master Plan covers the sector and quite aggressively, the sector itself was not permitted to have representation there. Interestingly, they didn't only lobby for scrap steel. So the lobby said, what we want is we don't get rid of the price preference system. In fact, keep it, and it's now been extended till 2027, but keep it on top of the export duties. And that's exactly what happens. But that group, again, out of that steel committee, did this for the whole lot of scrap metals, whether it be ferrous or non-ferrous. So it covered copper, aluminium, everything you can think about. And so we've got another big chunk of money being removed from the economy, not quite as much as the PPS, but export duties paid were about 460 or so million rand a year. And then the driver that is probably the most invisible, but has an enormous impact on the market, is friendly IDC finance. I deliberately didn't put down cheap finance because we're struggling to get a sense of what the prices on the particularly the debt was. But the IDC are a very, very big player in the space. And so just to give perspective to how much money we're talking about, South Africa's flagship industrial policy is the automotive sector. The automotive sector benefits to the tune of about 35 billion rand a year, which is a lot of money. The PPS benefit just on steel is about a quarter of that per year. So truly very large amounts of money. Now, if you do it per job, these mini mills are incredibly capital intensive. I mean, think about it for a minute. You have a truck, it arrives with scrap, you unload the scrap, you melt it in this big pot, you pour it out into whatever you're producing. So very capital intensive, not terribly labor intensive. This is perhaps a little bit of a cheeky assessment I've done here, but the scrap metal consumers receive, if you just take it at a per job level, about 8 times as much as the automotive producers, and the subsidies that go to the clothing producers about 60 times as much. And clothing, of course, is labor intensive. So the question would be, what are we hoping to accomplish with these mini mills? Well, it's not job creation because they are not very big job creators. The chairman of Cape Gate, the second biggest, I think, consumer of scrap steel in the country, said that the sector employs about 3,000 people. So the subsidy is not going into a labor-intensive part of our economy. What it does do, of course, is it definitely reduces the price of the product they manufacture. And just for a moment, that feels like just a very good thing to keep those products cheap. But we'll see in a moment what the implications of that are. Because we produce, and if you add imports to it, if the production of steel plus imports of steel, far too much for the amount of consumption in the country. And so very predictably, many of the products made out of the scrap steel, for example, are exported. Whether it be rebar, whether it be billet, or something to that effect. Now, the effect of this, because such a significant portion leaves the country, is we're subsidizing foreign consumers of the product. And it's not clear to me why that's a good deal. Why do we want to provide cheap product to a foreign consumer, admittedly possibly struggling in Japan or the US, wherever the case the product goes? But in fact, because it is subsidized, all of that trade has the risk of finding itself on the wrong side of a countervailing investigation, an anti-subsidy investigation, or possibly an anti-dumping case. So there are definitely risks here. We could say, well, you know what? The ArcelorMittal, as the primary manufacturer, is a monopoly if you exclude these mini mills. And so we need to bring in more competition for them. They have behaved badly in the past. They got a big fine from the Competition Commission. So we say, well, what we need to do is bring in more competition so that ArcelorMittal keeps their prices nice and honest. Now, that might be fine. You can introduce that competition by just allowing imports in, of course, and then you won't charge the rest of the industry in South Africa a cost to establish it. But you could say we're going to put money into the mini mills. The problem is there's too much that has gone in. There's, without a shadow of a doubt, been overinvestment, which I'll demonstrate in a moment. But what you will find is as investment in the sector goes up, So we see the PPS rules becoming more complicated. So, and by complicated, what I mean is typically extra rules are being added. And so from 2008 to 2012, that's the period when we have the export permits that are required. And then from 2012, we have two big transactions that happen. The one is the IDC purchases Score from Anglo American for quite a hefty amount of money. But they purchased Score from Anglo American, and then a company called DHT Investment Holdings buys Cisco. Cisco is the Cape Town Iron and Steel Company, not the networking equipment company. This is a Turkish company. And in fact, when they do the purchase, they're all over engineering news talking about the fact that this has to be contingent on access to raw materials. And then in 2013, the PPS rules are first implemented. And so they've been around for quite a while. And you can see after implementation, we see more and more rules being added. And then another big event happens. It turns out the IDC is not great at running a business. And so they get rid of this cash bleeding investment called Score, and they sell it to the Barnes Group. And this transaction is however funded in at least part by the IDC, it would appear. And then after that, the lobbying simply goes into overdrive, and we see lots and lots of extra rules added. And then in 2021, they kind of catch everyone out, and the working group succeeds and gets these export duties put in place. And so let's understand that when we talk about the 30% discount on steel, that's the starting point. But in fact, that number gets larger, particularly as you're further away from Gauteng. So almost all of the scrap consumers are in Gauteng, but of course, scrap metal is generated all over the country. And so in 2021, another rule is passed, and this new rule says that the seller has to cover the cost of transport. Now, if you're right across the road from the mini mill, that's not really an issue to worry about. But if you're in Cape Town, which is probably the furthest point from Gauteng, that cost can become quite high. And that at the moment comes in at about 1,000 Rand a ton to move the scrap metal from Cape Town to Gauteng. So think about that. To the seller in Cape Town, that's simply another 1,000 Rand per ton discount. And because if you read the report where I cover this in more detail, because there's a shortage of trucks running on that route, that even securing the truck can be problematic. Now, adding to all of this, just a few months ago, one of these large mini mills sent a note out to their suppliers of scrap. And they said, look, if you bring your scrap here and it drives over our drawbridge and we find a problem with the scrap, it's not graded correctly, whatever the case might be, if the truck's been unloaded, you will have to cover the cost of reloading it, and we're just going to charge you an extra 1,000 Rand a ton before we'll let the truck leave the premises. Now, how do they get away with such a thing? Well, the problem is they're under no obligation to travel to Cape Town or wherever else to make sure the product is on spec. All the sorts of things you would expect in a market where you're desperate to get hold of this raw material. So all of the risk sits perpetually with the seller. And this allows a cranking up of the effective discount. And government, for the most part, does not intervene. Sometimes they do, but for the most part, when bad offers are made, they're just kind of allowed to persist. And so the effective discount starts to become quite a lot larger than if the negotiation was simply between two parties that were trying to find a transaction price. Now, of course, what has happened is if you're in Cape Town and you can't get a truck to Gauteng, normally what you would do is you would just export the product. But you can't do that because if you've had an offer from someone in Gauteng, you can't get an export permit issued. And so you're kind of stuck at that point. and hence the ability to kind of squeeze these companies. I'd mentioned earlier that there is an oversupply of steel in the market. Now, Score Metals, the biggest consumer of scrap steel in the country, has just brought another 250,000 tons of hot rolled steel capacity to the market, increasing the hot roll capacity by about 50%. This is an important investment. Firstly, for those who've never seen it, it is amazing. It is an incredible thing to see what they have done there, without a shadow of a doubt. They've spent a lot of money, but why on earth would you do that if there's too much product in the market? And of course, the reason you can do that is because your raw material that you're paying for is not adjusting to the demand in the market like anyone else. And so what is happening is, because you have an ability to block the export, you can still secure your product at a very good price, which makes you competitive. Now, the argument made in the media announcement by Score is that what will happen with this new plant is they're gonna replace all of these imports. And they say, look, we're about 56% cheaper than China. In fact, they say that on rebar, sorry, not hot rolled steel. We don't know how much cheaper they are, but presumably they would be cheaper. Otherwise, they would struggle with China. But the problem is that volume is not going to replace the next cheapest product in the market. It is in all likelihood going to replace product out of ArcelorMittal. And that's fine, except that ArcelorMittal don't also get subsidized. And so what is happening is the subsidy is effectively moving value from one protected sector in the market, which is the ArcelorMittal primary production, and it is shifting that value to another part of the value chain. But we're not, to my mind, growing the overall value of the economy. What we're doing instead is we're just shifting money from one place to the other. Now, if ArcelorMittal are struggling to compete with imports from China, and on many of the products coming out of the mini mills, they are substantially cheaper than China, then I struggle to see how they are going to be competitive against China right on their doorstep, not having to cover transport, not having to pay duties. So remember, the funding for all of this is flowing out of those scrap metal generators. Now, when you look at the original announcement that Score put out in 2022, they said, we're gonna put in this plant, it's gonna cost us 2 billion rand, and it's gonna produce 300,000 tons. When they put out the latest notice, which was just a few weeks ago, they said, we've just put in 5 billion rand, and we're gonna produce 250,000 tons. That's an enormous difference in variation of investment per ton that you are going to produce. And it strikes me as a problem that will best be solved by applying even further pressure on government to put further restrictions on the upstream suppliers to force that subsidy to increase. And I'm saying that without that having happened, but that would appear to be the logical way for this particular problem to be solved. And because there is so much money flowing around in the sector, it de-risks these investments in a way that you can do things you wouldn't normally do. If you have a look in the report, we don't cover it in detail in here in the presentation, but in the report you can get a true sense of just how big those exposures are. But let me just give you some highlights here. So the steel sector you can think of as being broken up between primary steel, which is kind of ArcelorMittal, the mini mills, imports, and fabricators. These are the people that buy the steel and make a pipe or make a burglar bar, whatever it is, out of the steel that they purchase. So 90% roughly of the employment is in fabrication. These are largely small businesses scattered all over the country. Primary steel production, very concentrated, largely around Gauteng, little bits in places like Newcastle, bits in Cape Town, mostly in Gauteng. Now, if you take the primary steel market and you look at the percentage of sales made in South Africa, roughly 50% of all sales of primary steel in South Africa are made by ArcelorMittal, about 20% by the mini mills, and around 30% by imports. But then when we look just at the mini mills in ArcelorMittal, the IDC's exposure to the mini mills, this is both debt and equity, according to Minister Patel, is 14 billion rand. ArcelorMittal's market capitalization is 1.5 billion. So there's something wrong in that space. If you put all of the mini mills together, in absolute value terms, it's very unlikely that you would get to something comparable to what you have at ArcelorMittal. And you could argue, well, it's market cap. It's not really an indication of anything. Maybe just the share price is weak at the moment. But it is, in fact, an indication of something. It's an indication of how the market values ArcelorMittal versus how the IDC chooses to value that sector. Now, we then had a look at the total IDC book, and we said, how much of that book is in business rescue? And it turns out 3 billion rand of the IDC's whole book is in business rescue, give or take about 3%. But 2 billion of the 3 billion rand that is in business rescue are scrap metal consumers. So it's a massively disproportionate of their book that is distressed is sitting in one sector. And why is that? Well, because when you make lots of cheap money presumably available, you give people a cheap raw material, you put all of the support in, you get more investment in the sector than you naturally would have. And in the report, we break that down into quite a lot more detail. In fact, SCORE says, look, what has to happen is that a whole lot of these businesses have to fail. There are too many of them. Some of them have to fail. And that is, in fact, happening. At the end of June, for example, a company called SA Steel Mills, which used to produce things like roof sheeting, got into this game, went into business rescue. I've been to their premises a few times. The IDC's exposure just to that business is 1.1 billion rand. Almost the market cap again of ArcelorMittal. There is simply no way that these two businesses are comparable. And I'm not for a moment suggesting ArcelorMittal don't come with a different set of problems, but just factually, these are not comparable businesses. To further quickly demonstrate the value extraction that we see here, we take Nampak. Nampak do something very useful. Since 2017, they publish in their annual report how much money they recover on scrap metal. They don't break it down by metal type, unfortunately. Predominantly, they generate in steel and aluminium. And we just do a very simple back of the cigarette box calculation. We say if it's 50-50, what would the effect be of if they had obtained the full price versus the discounted price? And over the last 7 years, Nampak alone have shifted about 579 million rand. Now, you could say that's not a bad deal. There is a greater good here, but Nampak's distressed. I mean, that's not a huge secret. They're not doing terribly well. Is that capital better served in a sector that cannot survive without the support, or is it better served inside Nampak? I don't know the answer to the question, but it's not obvious to me that money is better suited in the pockets of the scrap metal consumers. There are other examples we note in the report. I mean, there was another intervention with Transnet where a directive was given to say Transnet may no longer sell their scrap metal on public auction. They have to sell directly to scrap consumers, dramatically shrinking the potential market for that product and obviously dropping the value on what they recover. Yet another entity that is capital hungry at the moment, but is subsidizing a sector that is unable to wash its own face. There's more detail in the report, but this is an extract out of the letter that was put out by Transnet management. So without a doubt a problem. We've put together a scrap metal master plan because everyone has to have a master plan. Ours is a little shorter than most of the others. The first and probably the most important issue is we need an independent economic review of the scrap metal industrial policy. It's been around roughly since 2013. There's plenty of data. This has to be an independent study. So it can't be a study done by the people who formulated the rules. And but we would like to see that done. It's not clear to me why this has not happened yet, given the amount of value being shifted around. It strikes me as a very, very important problem to solve. And I'd go a step further and say the outcome of that review needs to be made public, not something that is kept secret. The other big issue, this is not really just related to scrap metal, but when these plans are formulated, it is simply unacceptable to exclude whole sectors of the value chain from the consultations. So you can't be in a position where one group of people in the room, competitors, are taking a decision on another group of people in the value chain, and those other people don't even know that there's a room where these discussions are happening in. That is problematic. It's in fact not clear to me at all why these master plan discussions are not open. It does concern me when you've got groups of competitors in a room who are having discussions that other people in that sector are just completely unaware of. There's an enormous baked-in advantage to be in the room, and we know that that advantage is there because we have evidence of the submissions that were secretly made by the working group. So we can see the payoff that happened by having that privileged access. And that strikes me as an important problem to be solved across all sectors. You can't have PPS and export duties. I mean, I would argue both of them should go. I can understand politically that is going to be problematic. But the idea that you just kind of keep loading up the protection and forcing another sector of the economy to keep making less and less money so that a very small group of people who are very small employers get to earn an enormous rent strikes me as problematic. And finally, the IDC has to reduce its exposure to the scrap consuming sector. It is just ludicrously exposed to one sector. And it's not clear to me why that is. So somewhere around 12% of all the IDC's investments are sitting in kind of one sector, which is a sector that doesn't survive without the support. So, it just stop overcapitalizing the sector, and at least some of the problems, I would guess, would diminish over time. And that, folks, that's been a lot of me talking. I'm very happy to take questions at this point, should there be any.
If anyone has a question, just please raise your hand and then I can unmute you to speak.
Mawonga?
Can you hear me?
Can hear you clearly. Hello.
Okay, my name is Mawonga. Surname is Madolo. I'm from the National Union of Mine Workers. So the union is now historically has been in the mining industry, but now we are a union that is also participating in the metal industry. As a result of that, we are party to the Engineering Bargaining Council. So yeah, maybe just a question from my side. I hear the concerns that you had raised in your presentation, and it appears that there are concerns in relation to the support that some of the key players that are being supported in the industry. And probably at the expense of the sort of lower scrap manufacturers. So what would want to hear, I did not hear anything in your presentation that really talks to if all the intervention that you seek to be done would have any impact on the employment. Part of what is the key to us as trade union is the protection of the existing employment and the ensuring that there's a creation of employment. So I would want to hear from you as to those key areas in your lobby, in your view, if they were to be addressed, what would they mean to employment, and what is your view? Because there's some view that suggests that all this is just done for the sake of protecting some workers whom are earning relatively high, and the view that if you are to break that and allow a situation where employers will just pay as they pleased, and that will follow on and ensuring that there's some employment. So I'd want to hear from you in relation to that. And also, I joined the presentation a bit late. I did not hear your introduction in terms of who you are, in terms of what is your interest, which institution do you represent, and what is your actual interest on the outcome, so that sometimes, for instance, when I introduce myself as from the union, you could conclude as to what interest do I have in the outcome of any discussion. So maybe just those two issues that I would want to hear from you. Thank you very much.
Mawonga, thank you, and I'm very glad you made the discussion today. So, let me start with your second question first. We're a very specialized global trade consultancy called XA Global Trade Advisors. We've been around for about 21 years. We started doing work in the scrap metal sector about 2020. It was in the middle of COVID, somewhere around there. And the reason this report and last year's report, in fact, let me maybe start with last year's report. The reason we wrote last year's report was on the 28th of November, 2023, an announcement came out by ArcelorMittal that they were looking to close Newcastle. And they identified a couple of reasons for that possible closure. And one of them identified was that they couldn't compete with the product that came out of these mini mills. And that was placing that part of their business at risk, because that kind of part of their business, as I understand it, is at the sharp end of where these sort of mini mills product and theirs compete. And so they said, well, that's a problem. That was such a kind of a shocking announcement that Arista and I sat over a weekend and we wrote up the whole of our first report. So we were not funded by the scrap metal sector to write this up. We're a very research intensive business, and it was simply one of those reports that we had put out. And then as we were kind of getting to the end of this year, we thought it would be a good idea to be doing another version of the report, because the story just got more and more interesting as more data became available. So let me be clear perhaps on where I stand on all of this. I'm not averse to the idea that there are times when government should be intervening in the market. I am very strongly opposed to irresponsible interventions in the market. I'm opposed to the idea that one part of the economy should be paying another part of the economy because they're not very good at what they do. I think that makes South Africa less competitive, and that has negative implications for things like employment. I mean, part of the reason we have high unemployment rates, at least in part, is that we give support to businesses that are not competitive. We make it very difficult for smaller companies, for example, to thrive. Having said all of that, Mawonga, we didn't do any work on the employment implications, and I take that as a problem. I mean, we should have, but we didn't. If you wouldn't mind, at the end of this, I have your details because you registered. I'd love to be able to just sit down and have a cup of coffee with you and talk through the labor side, and quite possibly when we publish the third edition of this, we can include more work on the labor side of this, if that's okay with you. I will be in touch. Manuel, your turn.
Can you hear me, Donald?
Yes, sir.
Okay, cool. I think in a way you have already answered the question I had, but it's essentially, if you, as you said, there are so many inconsistencies, right? What's your hunch? Why there are so many inconsistencies coming from not necessarily from the private sector, but from the regulators? Is it just bad economics because people don't know economics? Is it just bad economics because people want to use bad economics? Is it political economy, vested interests? What's your hunch? Thanks.
Yeah. Manuel, just before I let you go and answer, just quickly introduce yourself, I think, so people know where you're from.
I'm sorry. My name is Manuel Bittencourt, and I'm a professor of economics at the University of Pretoria. Thank you.
Thank you. Manuel, so I'm not entirely sure what has caused the kind of pileup of what I think are bad regulations, but I suspect a lot of this started with actually very good intentions. So I think concern number one was, well, we have this dominant monopoly. We should get some competition in, and we think that's probably a good idea. And there's some merit in that. One has to be careful with monopolies. So maybe the thought was we have to do something. But I think what ends up happening is, firstly, when companies get their first taste of that free money, they're not going to let that go very easily. And so one of the problems when we construct industrial policy in South Africa is we never set expiry dates to these things. And so what will very quickly happen is when you're getting free money and you're confronted with a challenge in your business and you think you can get more, almost always the equation works out better to spend money and lobby to get some additional support rather than fixing whatever the underlying problem in your business is. And I haven't done enough on the mini mills. Again, maybe in the next report we'll look at it. But there's a fundamental question of, if you're in an energy-intensive business, I mean, if effectively your product is electricity mixed with scrap metal, and electricity is getting more and more expensive, at some point, South Africa loses any comparative advantage in that space. And of course, that's obviously problematic, but the signal isn't getting through because the signal is muted because you've got the intervention that is preventing that kind of message getting through. So if your electricity price goes up, but you can squeeze the other suppliers, then that's obviously not a problem for you, but it is a problem for the suppliers who have to keep getting squeezed for money every time something unrelated to them happens in your business. So I think that would be kind of my comments on that. And before I get to the hands that have been raised, I'm just going to take some of the written questions. Ricardo, nice to chat with you again. Have you looked at some of the interesting similar trends in non-ferrous? Ricardo, not for this particular report. The Arista and I were talking about it. In the next report, our focus will be on non-ferrous. The problem with the non-ferrous is it's many different things. So it's copper, it's aluminium, and all sorts of stuff. So it's a little bit more complicated, but the next report is going to have a much stronger look at the non-ferrous market. Tyrone, have there been any signs that Minister Tau is open to reviewing the scrap regulations or been willing to listen to the scrap generators, recyclers? My answer to that is yes, I think so. So it certainly appears that way. I mean, this review that is currently underway on PPS is, in my mind, a good sign. I mean, we don't know what's going to come out of it, but I'm feeling more optimistic than I have in many years. Mike Benfield, hello, Mike. Good to have you here too. Please comment on the argument that long steel, primarily produced from scrap, is far cheaper in the SA market than the international market. Therefore, the benefit of the PPS subsidy is being passed on to the consumer. Mike, that obviously is a good thing. In our report, which all of you will receive as soon as this finishes, that's obviously a very good thing. The problem is it's not money that's appearing out of thin air. So that 8.5 billion rand that is causing that long steel, for example, to be cheaper is being taken away from other companies. So for every rand of discount that you're getting, somebody else is funding it. And in some cases, those SOEs, it's not clear to me that an artificially cheap long steel product is a good trade-off when a company like Nampak, for example, is distressed. And that literally is the trade-off. So, it is not a victimless crime. It's not a crime, I guess, but yes, it's I think it's problematic. So I'm not a fan of this. I'm not a fan of markets whose prices are distorted. When things are artificially cheap, people overconsume, which is why we have all of this investment pressure. So I'm not a fan of that, and I don't see why that is so important. Would we be completely uncompetitive with market-related prices on long steel? You'd know the answer better than me, but it's not clear to me that we would be. Ricardo, again, does the IDC publish the nature of debt equity used to assess the IDC's financial interests? Secondly, is it possible to assess financial profit extraction from SA from low value, highly profitable metal beneficiation? We don't have that data, Ricardo, but I think that's an incredibly good question. I'm going to ask Arista to put that down as something we need to look at in future. What we do have, though, is we have a breakdown of the IDC's book, which is in the public domain if anyone wants it. But that gives us a list of every investment they have and what their debt and equity exposure in each sector is. And it is in the public domain. Like I said, if anyone wants it, I think you just contact me. I'll come to you, Toby. I just want to take Mark Fine's question. Mark, go ahead.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Just introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Mark Fine. I'm the fourth generation of a metal recycling family since 1903. I have a recycling business in Cape Town, and I also have served on the national executive of the Metal Recyclers Association, and I have a forum for the Scrap Recycling Coalition. So I'm involved quite deeply in recycling interests on a national basis. Just the one comment, or two comments. The first one, just the gentleman that spoke about employment. One of the things that happens when you have these kind of meetings and interactions with government is you have large companies that can quantify the extra employees that they actually are going to employ, for example, but it ignores the bottom end of or the reality of it. So, for example, it's estimated that there are about 300,000 waste pickers around the country, most of whom will engage and get a significant percentage of their income from collecting scrap metal. So we talk about old, gates and washing machines and cans on the side of the road, you name it. And those waste pickers, around about 300,000 of them, but prior to PPS and other interventions, for example, they would have been just a straight back of the napkin commenters, Donald likes. Those waste pickers would have been earning 150 Rand a day, and after the PPS, they would be earning 100 Rand a day. So you talk a pretty small amount of money, 50 Rand a day, but that 50 Rand a day is going into the pockets of the mini mills, and it's coming out of the pockets of those extremely poor subsistence waste pickers. In the metal recycling industry, we've been struggling to hold our own and against the onslaught from government and mini mills. But just speaking for myself, for example, we've halved our employment since the advent of PPS. And maybe even more important is when you have the bigger manufacturing companies like Nampak that are transferring money that they could have used to upgrade the equipment, build new plants, and essentially add on new highly skilled and well-paying jobs. It's not happening. It's just not happening. So the effect is, although it might be unseen because it's a whole lot of smaller things or it's intangible, there is a phenomenal effect on employment. So these couple of thousand of extra jobs that are costing 5 or 10 million rand a year in subsidies, it pales in significance. That's the first point. The second one is there's a huge problem, and I presume it's in the report or in some form, and that is that you have the DTRC and its subsidiary, RDC, as well as obviously I suppose you could say the enforcement agency or regulator, being RTAC. You have a very strange situation where the biggest benefactors from the policies that are implemented by DTRC are themselves. Because RDC is they must be way and away the biggest investor in this whole sector that is receiving the benefits, and that falls directly under the DTRC. So you have almost the judge, jury, and executioner sitting in the same office. And yeah, it's anything I want to say at this point. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. In fact, I'm going to ask if you wouldn't mind answering the next question, because you're in the sector. The question is from Toby Chance. Toby says, is it possible the mini mills will shift to gas as electricity prices continue to rise? I'm unable to answer that.
Yeah, I'm not a consumer of scrap. I'm a supplier of scrap. So there must be other alternative sources of energy for the melting. But I think that the most popular, as you mentioned, electric arc furnaces, I think it's probably even more popular now is the induction furnaces, all of which require electricity. However, to co-generate or generate that electricity, I'm pretty sure that they are really investigating, if not implementing alternatives to Eskom. But I can't answer as regards whether that would be gas or not.
Thank you. Last round of questions from anyone? All right. What will happen is right at the end of this, all of you will receive a link where you can download the report. Everything in the report is supported. So, should anyone wonder where we got the data from, we generally footnote it. If you think anything is missing or you think we're making shit up, feel free to get hold of me. We're very happy to share whatever data we have that underpins all of this. And of course, you have my details, you have Arista's details. If you have any questions at all, please get hold of us.